Hello, my name is Xenophon Papadimitris. I'm a professor in biomedical informatics and data science here at Yale. This is one of the supplementary interviews we record for the new certificate program in medical software and medical AI. Our guest today is Donna-Bea Tillman. She's a principal consultant at Biologics Consulting Group. She has over 30 years of experience in medical regulatory work. Prior to joining Biologics Consulting, she spent 17 years at the FDA in various positions, first with the Center of Device and Radiological Health, and this culminated in 2004, where she was appointed to be director of the Office of Device Evaluation, where she oversaw the medical device premarket review program for non-IVD devices. During her time at FDA, she played a pivotal role in the development of guidance, documents, standards, and policy frameworks for medical device software and health IT. In 2010, she left FDA and joined Microsoft Health Solutions Group as the Director of Regulations and Policy, who is responsible for obtaining the appropriate global pre-market registrations and managing Microsoft post-market safety programs. She joined Biologics in 2012, and over the past 12 years, submitted more than 100 510(k) applications, as well as several noteworthy de novos in the digital health space. We might hear about some of them. Donna-Bea received her B.S.E in engineering from Tulane and her Ph.D. in Biomedical Engineering from Johns Hopkins. And she also has a master's in public administration from American University. So welcome. Thanks for taking the time for this conversation. Let's start just at the beginning here. How did the FDA discover software? How did the FDA get in the software business? Now we start with food, cosmetics, drugs, devices. This new thing called software one day hit you. How did that happen? How does the story begin?
Yeah, so FDA didn't actually start formally regulating medical devices until 1976. And back then, there were not even a lot of medical devices that had software in them. But over time, I would say over the next 10 to 12 to 15 years, software started showing up in medical devices. We had some things like early pacemakers. We had medical imaging systems. We had ECG and monitoring devices that started to incorporate some basic software functionality. That is where FDA started with software, which was software in medical devices.
So what was the first response of the agency to that? Like at some point you realized that you had to do something about software. There were some concerns. I mean, software became a safety issue, I assume, at some point, and there are some famous accidents from the 80s. So what were the beginnings of that process?
Yeah, there were sort of two things that happened. The first was that FDA was seeing software in medical devices as part of pre-market submissions. And so they put together a guidance document in 1991, which was the reviewer guidance for computer-controlled medical devices undergoing 510(k) review. So this was the great-granddaddy of the software guidance that we frankly still have out there today. And it laid out a basic framework that talked about, if you got software in your medical device, what information do you need to provide to FDA when you submit something? And it had things in it that you might expect to see, like software risk analysis, requirements, design documentation, verification and validation testing. So it developed, a set of documents that FDA wanted you to submit. And it also developed a framework for the idea that not all software was the same. So you might have software, for example, in a light system that's in an operating room. Even back then, people were starting to put simple software things in lower risk devices. But then you've got stuff like pacemaker that's higher risk. So the second thing that this guidance did was develop kind of a risk-based framework for the kinds of documentation FDA would ask for. And it developed this idea of what we call level of concern: minor, moderate, major. The higher the level of concern, the more documentation that you would need to provide. What's also interesting about this point in time is that at this point in time, there was no quality system regulation. The quality system regulation didn't get implemented until 1996. And also, it's hard for some of you who may be listening to understand what the world was like back in 1991. We had no internet. There was no World Wide Web or no cell phones. And Windows 3.0 had just been released. So, we have a very different world in terms of what FDA is looking for. And the other thing that FDA did back then was they developed a draft document we call the software policy document from 1989. And this was the sort of second major step that FDA took, which was saying that software by itself could be a medical device. if you look at the definition of a medical device, it doesn't actually include the word software, or it didn't until relatively recently. And so there was some question about whether software by itself could actually be a device. And FDA said, yes, software is a contrivance. And one of the words in the definition of a medical device is a contrivance. And so FDA said, yep, software can be a medical device. And then they developed this software policy document that talked about, well, what kinds of software might FDA be interested in regulating, and what kinds of software might FDA not be interested in regulating. And so that was the 89 software policy document. And it created this very interesting concept of competent human intervention. And it was a big thing that FDA looked at back in those early days to try to figure out if it was going to regulate software or not, which is, can the person using the device exercise competent human intervention in terms of figuring out whether the software is given the right answer or not? And so, that document was out there. There's a version of it, I think, linked down in the comments that you can take a look at. It was used for a very long time until some of the more recent things came into play. But those are the first two steps FDA took back in the late 80s, early 90s.
So it's funny that 35 years later, in the era of AI, human in the loop as risk management is the human competent? Can they really be a risk mitigator as they are? It's funny how everything goes back. Actually, as an aside here, what were the inputs to this process? What were people reading? What was the literature around? Was it just software engineering literature? Was it safety literature? Where did it start? Now there's 1,000,001 things one can read to think about these topics, but what was there then? What was the inspiration for some of this?
Yeah, I think a lot of in terms of what documentation was necessary in order to support a safe medical device, that first piece that I was talking about, the guidance document, it was software engineering as an engineering discipline that was starting to come into play at that point in time. We were starting to develop as an engineering discipline, thinking about how do you develop a life cycle model and manage software in a way to make to increase the likelihood that the software that you build is actually going to meet user requirements and do what it's supposed to do. So I think there were some IEEE standards back then that talked about how to do good software engineering process. So that was kind of what fed into that reviewer guidance on software controlled medical devices. The software policy, some of it talked about things that were explicitly not regulated as medical devices that were actually in the regulations. So for example, anything used for training stuff is not regulated as a device. Things like general purpose computing equipment. And so that whole idea, which is going to come up again when we talk about digital health, there was some language in that software policy about that. So it was more focused on the sort of regulatory policy things. And then this competent human intervention, where that came from, I think my opinion, I wasn't there in 89. I didn't join FDA until 94. But I think it was just sort of something that kind of made sense to people, that if you had somebody that could sort of be around to provide a second level of checking on what the software was doing, then maybe, you would need to exercise fewer regulatory controls.
Okay, so that's the beginnings. And as things evolve, and I guess that begins your time at FDA too, how did the process evolve after that? Where did we go in the early PC era? Well, here it is.
Exactly. So, that guidance went out. It started becoming, the industry became aware of it. And then the next thing that really started to happen was the increasing use of off-the-shelf software, or SOUP, or whatever you want to call it. FDA calls it off-the-shelf software. And this is actually where I started getting involved with software at FDA. I was at FDA during that time period. And we put together a working group to start to think about, well, we've already talked about what documentation needs to be provided to FDA for the software that a company writes. How is FDA and the company going to make sure that third-party software that's put into medical devices, that it's functioning appropriately? What's the right level of documentation to provide to FDA about that? And so I think that also became sort of an important consideration. And, once again, FDA took sort of a risk-based approach where they said, well, if you've got a if you've got a sort of a low level of concern device, it's enough to basically describe what the off-the-shelf software is doing, how you're going to manage it, how you're going to make sure that when there's changes made that you're on top of all that. And then for higher risk devices like pacemakers and other higher risk devices, you're going to need to have a little bit more confidence about whether or not it's appropriate to use that software. I always like to say back then, imagine a thought experiment where this was back in the mid 90s. So Windows was just becoming a thing. And I'd say, imagine you got on an airplane and you're sitting in the seat and the pilot's given his before flight spiel. And the pilot comes on and says, our airplane today is being flown by Windows. How many of you would get up and try to get off the plane? And so I think that this idea that, third-party software has its place, but there are some times when it's appropriate and sometimes that it was not.
Yeah. And for people who are younger than a certain age, younger than us, certainly, in that era, we wrote most of our code, right? There was no internet to download libraries. The nuclear commands like pb installed and npm installed for Python, JavaScript that people are used to, like the amount of third-party things that we had access to was very limited. It wasn't like the most common source of external code in that era. I was a graduate student back then, was typing code in from a book. Right? It was less common to be able to download libraries that did complicated things. But the progression goes from probably back then where you wrote 95% of your code to maybe now where you write 5% of your code and 95% is operating system libraries, drivers, all of those things. So it was early days, but I think that is now almost one of the central challenges because we write so little of the code that's actually involved in software.
I think that's a great point too. I mean, a lot of the early concerns were about things like operating systems, but you mentioned typing in your own code. I remember that I was getting my Ph.D. and I finished up in the early 90s, and I did a bunch of mathematical modeling as part of my Ph.D. project. And I had this book called Numerical Recipes, and it had all of these it had code in there. I think it was written in, I think it was C code. And you could go, if you needed to do some kind of an issue in terms of series analysis or whatever you needed to do, you could go in there and I actually did that. I went in there and I typed code right out of that book. So yeah, there was a lot of that going. It was a different world. And back then, there was no Google. We had really primitive browsers, Mosaic and Netscape. Anybody heard of them today? And at that point in time, mobile phones also. We didn't have any data on our phones. We did have mobile phones, but they only had voice and some basic primitive text messaging. So
yeah.
So that was going on then. And then the other thing that was happening is around that time is when the quality system regulation was implemented in 96. And the next question that came up was, well, what does it mean to validate software? And you might think with this big quality system regulation, which basically says software has to be validated, there's nothing in the quality system regulation that says what software validation actually means. And so, I was also involved with this at FDA. A small group of us got together and we wrote a guidance document that a lot of people know and love called the General Principles of Software Validation, where we were trying to provide guidance to the industry about what were best practices for how to validate software. What does software validation actually mean? And this document actually was the great granddaddy of the software lifecycle standard SW68, which eventually became ISO 62304, which is out there today and still going strong.
So the quality system regulation comes in.
Right.
What's this sort of background to that? What was the ancestor of that? What other quality systems did you guys look at? Because quality systems, start with the military probably in the 40s, late 30s, early 40s, certainly World War II. And then we have, the whole Japanese industry explosion and quality control there. So what were you guys looking at as you wrote the quality system regulation back then?
So, before the quality system regulation, we had GMPs, good manufacturing practices. And when the first medical device statute was enacted in 1976, the idea, the GMP regulations were put in there for devices, and they were basically built on the drug GMPs. But the problem is devices are a lot different than drugs. I mean, drugs are, you might come up with a drug. I always like to say drugs are discovered and devices are designed. Now that was more true in the past than perhaps it is today. I think there's more drug design going on nowadays, but back then that was the case. And so is all we had were good manufacturing practices, which talked about how do I take a design for a catheter and build 100,000 of them, and really about the manufacturing process. How do I systematically make sure that my manufacturing is producing the device I think it is, and that it's meeting my standards? The whole idea of, well, what happens before you get to manufacturing? What happens when you're designing that device? And those we call the design controls. That was really, in my mind, one of the most significant parts of the quality system regulation, was the idea that the reason why most devices fail, and in particular most software devices fail, is not because they're not manufactured correctly, although that does happen, is because they're not designed correctly. Either the user requirements aren't well understood, or the requirements are improperly implemented. And so, the quality system regulation was really an attempt to develop a more, as you mentioned, based on other industries that had those kinds of things. The nuclear industry, I think, is another one that there was some of that was fed into this, was really the idea that we needed to have a more systematic methodology for making sure that we were designing devices correctly.
Right. And so we have this process from drugs to devices to software inside devices. Right. And then we get to this point where software can live on its own, right? The hardware now becomes generic, so we stop worrying about it for certain applications. Obviously, we're doing robotics, imaging, and so on. But a lot of the medical device now is a computation. It's analyzing some data that comes from elsewhere. So now this is another transition. We now have software as a medical device, right? With the hardware being generic, and we can usually sort of safely not ignore it, but for all intents and purposes, it's not important. So talk us through that process. What did that take to do, and where did it go?
So where this really started actually was in the medical imaging space. That was in terms of FDA. We had some software as a medical device that had been around for a little while. We had interpretive ECG is a good example. That had been around for a little bit, where you had software that would look at an ECG waveform and try to identify different arrhythmias. But that was still, even though it was a software function, it was still largely baked into a medical device. It was part of an ECG device. But in medical imaging, we really started with the idea of software as a device on its own. And in 1998, FDA actually formally classified medical imaging software. So prior to that time, that software it hadn't been considered when the medical device amendments were enacted back in '76. We didn't have medical imaging software. And so FDA created a series of regulations around what they call picture archiving and communication systems, or PACS devices. And these were software things that were intended to store medical images, to display them, and to analyze medical images. And so the idea is that you've got a medical image and you're going to maybe digitize it, and then now you've got a digital version of that image, and you can do things like make measurements on it. You can do things perhaps like if you've got a CT scan where you got a bunch of slices, create a 3D reconstruction of the heart and the different slices so that somebody can view that heart in 3 dimensions. And so, that was when FDA, I think, really first started systematically reviewing software as a medical device, and then it gradually came into other clinical fields as well.
So, and it's interesting, right? Because images were probably the first time where the acquisition and the reading were separated by this backend, the PACS, the database. So now the images are acquired, they're stored, and now they're pulled out of storage to be read. So the processing is separate from the acquisition, whereas the ECG was done in one go, right? It's just integrated into it. And, for those of you new to this field, electronic medical records and all of that were still in the future for all intents and purposes. So that was the one big digital database in a hospital, which makes sense that it would be there. So if you look at a PACS system, and this is where we're beginning now to more modern era perhaps, is part of it is regulated, part of it isn't regulated, right? I mean, not the whole PACS system is regulated. So let's talk through that, right? So we're now moving even further down this road. We forget about the hardware, And now we're beginning not quite to forget, but stop worrying about some of the software too. Yes, right? A piece of the software is regulated now, and a piece is some. So talk us through that, and how do people? And now we're in the modern era, so it's not just of historical interest. How should one think about that even today? Yes.
Yeah, so it's definitely evolved over time. A couple of other interesting things that happened around that time relating to imaging was the emergence of digital radiology and digital mammography in particular. FDA regulates mammography under something called the Mammography Quality Standards Act. So it's another statute that FDA actually enforces. And FDA actually exercises a fair amount of control over mammography programs, working with the states. And when digital mammography became a thing, when people said, hey, instead of doing mammograms with film, we're going to now create sensors and do digital mammography. When that first came out, FDA said, you know what, that's kind of, we've got some concerns about that. And they actually made those devices PMAs, which is the higher level of regulatory than a 510K, which is the lower level. So digital mammography devices were actually originally PMA devices. And part of that reflected FDA's lack of comfort with digital imaging. It was still kind of a new thing. And some of the very early software to analyze digital mammograms and determine regions of interest that might be suspicious, software that looks at a mammogram and says, there's something funny over here. Radiologists, you should look at that. And we called those CAD devices, computer assisted detection devices. That came out, and those were PMAs as well. Now, what's interesting is over time, as FDA got more comfortable with those products, those devices have actually been down classified. So digital mammography devices and breast CAD devices actually no longer require PMAs. FDA rarely reduces its level of regulatory oversight, but this is an example where it did. So those devices, FDA on its own decided, you know what, we don't need PMAs for these anymore. We're going to down classify them. And so those devices are actually class 2 now, and they only require 510Ks. So, I think what we saw is this emergence of this digital imaging, a lot of concerns, worries about what we didn't know because we're used to the old way of doing it. And then as over 10 or 15 years, when it became better known, then FDA saying, you know what, this isn't such a big deal. We can down classify it. And what that enabled FDA to do is when the same sorts of questions started coming up in other areas of imaging, like lung software analysis or software that looks at a dental x-ray to figure out whether there are cavities. The breast one kind of came first, and then a lot of the other stuff came after it, and FDA started to apply a lot of those same considerations to these other products.
So, okay, so we have all the software. We're beginning to use it. We're beginning to trust it. We're beginning to down-regulate it, which for people who don't know what type of savings that involve in both pages of money and years of studies is a non-insignificant thing. But now we're beginning to think about even parts of the software that are not really regulated, right? We have functions that are and functions that are not. Let's talk through that a little bit, how that process works.
Yeah. So, there was a little bit of a history with that as well. So back just around the time I left FDA started dealing with what they were calling medical device data systems. And this was sort of we talked about PACS. So a PACS system has a part of the system that stores the image data, part of the system that transmits the image data from this point to this point, part of the software system that displays it. And in general, FDA exercises less regulatory oversight over that than it does for the software that does a 3D reconstruction of the heart. So then the question became one of, well, more and more medical devices were now developing the ability to put out digital data, like your anesthesia machine. Now, all of a sudden, it was possible to hook your anesthesia machine up to an electronic patient record and download a whole bunch of data about that patient or your ventilator. And so what was happening is as devices and as the emergence of networks within the hospital started to come around and electronic health record systems, we now have this vast amount of digital data that's coming out of medical devices that are being used in a lot of different ways that are going into this hospital network and then getting stored in these electronic health record systems. And, originally FDA's idea was going to regulate all of that as a class 1 device that required a quality system, but didn't require a pre-market submission. And that was the original, what we call medical device data system rule that FDA put out. And then what happened is we had this whole, back in 2010, we had this whole emergence of something called the High-Tech Act, which was, there was this economic bailout program that happened around that time that some of you may be aware of. And as part of that, there was a huge amount of money that the federal government pumped into electronic health records. Mm-hmm. They created the whole Office of the National Coordinator for Electronic Health Record Systems. And there was this big push to move the medical community into an electronic health record system. And those people who are doing that, which was part of Health and Human Services, said to FDA, hey, you're going to regulate this. That's going to get in the way. We don't think that you should be regulating these things. And so what happened was that FDA actually said, you know what, we're not actually going to regulate medical device data systems anymore. We changed our mind. So put out this rule, said we're going to regulate them. And then they said, nope. On second thought, we're going to exercise enforcement discretion and not regulate them. And then in 2017, Congress came along with something called the 21st Century Cures Act and basically removed those products from the definition of a medical device entirely. So you had this whole transition where FDA was going to regulate these things. Then they said, well, maybe we'll not. And then Congress said, you can't regulate. So we end up with a system where there are parts of these electronic health record systems in hospitals that are not regulated at all because they're like electronic health record systems, and then parts that are. And there's a whole series of FDA guidance documents and policies about what will be regulated and what won't. And I think the most important piece out of this, because it's kind of complicated, is the question of clinical decision support. So in general, FDA has said that it's not going to regulate the sort of architecture part of this, moving data around, storing data, putting it here, putting it there, doing all that. Not going to regulate that. But now what if you start taking all of this data and, for example, I got a whole lot of data in my patient record, and it's going to tell me whether I've got sepsis or not. Or somebody's going to write a machine learning AI-based algorithm that's going to mine all this EHR data on these individual patients to determine if they've got sepsis or if they're developing high blood pressure or whatever. That is where the agency's more recent attention has turned. And, as we've gotten into the whole AI ML space, lots of interest in a lot of regulatory oversight about how those data are used.
Let's switch gears a little bit. The other big thing that happened in the space is mobile devices, right? All of a sudden, everybody has a computer in their pocket or on their wrist, or other incarnations of this that are yet to come, rings, glasses, what have you. And now these are beginning to be almost a platform of choice for many things, and that has its own unique challenges. You are involved in some of that work as part of your consulting career. So let's talk about those challenges and how they have affected how we think about how the agency thinks, how people design things. Where are we there?
Yeah, so the first thing that started happening is we started getting phones that had data capabilities, right? And we could look at stuff on our phones that normally we used to have to only look at on a computer screen. And so the first question that FDA had to deal with, well, if I have software now and it's running on my phone, does that make my phone a medical device if the software is a medical device software? And FDA's answer to that, which I think was the right one, was no. In the same way that FDA doesn't regulate general purpose computing platforms as medical devices, like your laptop or a desktop computer, or even a large data center at a hospital that's running a big PACS system, that just because your phone has medical device software on it doesn't make the phone a medical device. So that part, I think, was fairly easy and consistent. It just represented the evolution from a computer being the thing on your desk to a computer being something you can carry around in your pocket. So that was pretty straightforward. And that FDA developed a mobile medical apps guidance document that came out in around 2011, and that's where they basically dealt with that. So that was easy. So the next thing that happened is we just started seeing wearables. And the thing about the wearables was not only were they computing platforms, they could show you your text messages or some basic functionality when they first came out, but they had sensors on them. And those sensors could be used for medical purposes. So how did that change the calculus? And so the question became one of, well, if I've got a sensor on my wearable and it can measure my heart rate, does that mean that my wearable device, because it's now got a sensor on it, does that make the wearable device regulated? And I think what was really important, and I think that FDA's decision on this really had critical implications for the digital health world that we see today. And I think a lot of it goes back to how FDA regulated the whole idea of exercise heart rate. So, and in order to understand that, you got to understand the whole issue of general wellness.
Yeah, and we'll get into that because that's both general wellness as a hardware thing, but also apps on the App Store, diets, suggestions, recommendations, and Google search maybe. So let's maybe conclude our discussion with that. Because that's also another nice fuzzy line here we have to learn about.
It is. Yeah. The whole digital health and wellness thing has been, we've just, if you look at what's happened over the past 5 years, it's just taken off. And actually, where this first started becoming an issue was back in the 90s, actually, where people started developing these wearable heart rate sensors that you would wear, like Polar had one. It would be like a chest strap that you would wear when you go out and run or when you were on the treadmill, and you could connect it with a cable to either to your treadmill or to it would have a little display that would show you what your heart rate is. And the question became one of, well, if you got a product and it's measuring heart rate, but it's only for exercise, is that a medical device? And what happened is FDA decided that, well, we're going to exercise enforcement discretion. So we're going to agree that that a product that is just measuring heart rate for exercise is not going to be regulated as a medical device. And this was really where the whole general wellness policy began, was with the idea that there were, like heart rate, for example, there were reasons you might want to know your heart rate that don't really have anything to do with whether you're sick or not. They're just, I want to get my exercise heart rate up to some level so that I can be in the aerobic zone and I can kind of do my good exercise routine. So that was really when FDA started first thinking about this idea of wellness. And then they published a guidance document in 2015 where they basically said that they were going to exercise enforcement discretion over products that were intended to be used to maintain or encourage a general state of health or healthy activity. So that's like counting your steps, showing what your heart rate is while you're exercising. And that they would also not regulate anything that relates to the role of a healthy lifestyle with the idea that it would reduce the impact of certain chronic diseases. So, for example, if I want to develop a calorie tracking app and I want to say that, this is going to help you to lose weight. And oh, by the way, if you lose weight, that might reduce your risk of becoming type 2 diabetic. That FDA would allow these kinds of claims to be made around those kinds of claims. And this actually also ended up getting enacted by Congress in 2017 as part of that 21st Century Cures Act that I mentioned in regards to medical device data systems. And what the Congress basically took what FDA had been doing by policy and implemented in its statute, where they basically said that software for maintaining or encouraging a healthy lifestyle that's unrelated to the diagnosis, mitigation, treatment, cure, prevention of a disease was not actually a medical device anymore. So Congress took what FDA had been doing and actually turned it into law. So what this means for these digital and wearable platforms is that if you have a sensor on it, and that sensor is only being used for a wellness activity, exercise heart rate, then it was not a device function. And so this was really the thing that allowed the first digital health products to go through as software only. So if we take the case study of the ECG app for the Apple Watch, which was really, I would say, the first product in this space, and we look at kind of how that worked. So you've got an app that runs on a phone, you've got an app that runs on a watch. The watch actually has ECG electrodes in it. And you might say, well, doesn't that make the watch a device? But you could make the argument that the heart rate that's measured by those ECG electrodes could be used for a general wellness function. So Apple could sell the watch. They could say, we've got an app. It's going to measure your heart rate while you're exercising. And that therefore, because there was a legitimate non-medical device purpose for those sensors, it didn't make the watch hardware regulated. And that then when Apple then went into FDA with its de novo for its ECG app, it could go in with a software-only product. And so this idea that we can divorce the software from the digital health platforms, that was really that was the first product that started that. And we have seen more and more of those. So for example, Samsung recently got a de novo granted by FDA for a sleep apnea feature that relies on the PPG sensor of a Samsung watch. Because the PPG sensor could be used for non-medical device purposes, it's not regulated. That was a software-only device. And the other interesting one that happened fairly recently was that Apple actually got a de novo recently for using the AirPods as a hearing aid. So hearing aids are regulated medical devices as well. Once again, FDA said, well, the AirPods have a non-medical device purpose. They're for listening to your music, but we're going to regulate the software as a software-only device. So I think, what we've seen is this evolution where we started off with software in a medical device, and then we have software kind of being on its own out there as just standalone software. And then we get software that's now running on these portable phones and wearable devices. And now we're back to this sort of standalone software or software as a medical device that's running on those products as well. And I think we're only going to see more and more of that. I feel like the health space is one of the most, there's this tremendous amount in the digital health space that's going on right now.
Was there anything else that you wanted to mention before we close this up? Was there anything?
No, I think that, that the next thing, as we sort of touched on, is AI, machine learning. So there's obviously, we could do a whole nother discussion just on that. It's a complicated enough scenario, and that is become an issue both once again in the medical imaging space is where I think we saw a lot of that beginning, but it's definitely morphing over into the digital health space as well. We've got Chat GPT, and how's FDA going to regulate AIs that start making medical recommendations? So I think there's still a lot of really interesting questions and problems yet to be resolved. So I think we've come a long way, but we've still got a long way to go.
Yeah, and I think just to conclude the conversation for the students, especially understanding where we came from, and this is some what we've tried to do today, it's kind of important because all these decisions build on things that happened, right? We did this, it worked out. Now there's a precedent. Now we can use that to think about a new problem, which is new, but not everything is new. A lot of these things have been around for a while in slightly different forms. So thank you for taking the time, and maybe we'll have a second conversation talk about AI sometime in the future.
Thank you very much.